The morning air in Ridgevale always smelled like sweet cinnamon and distant dreams, especially outside Carter's bakery, the little corner store Melanie Carter's mother, Denise, ran with trembling hands and relentless hope. Melanie, now 26, wasn't born into privilege or even comfort. Raised in the modest rear apartment behind the bakery alongside her spirited younger sister Camille, her childhood was laced with flour, unpaid bills, and prayers whispered into cracked ceilings. Denise Carter, once a vibrant literature teacher, had lost her job after her husband, Melanie's father, abandoned them for a younger woman and fled the state with most of their savings. Life turned survivalist after that. Melanie stepped up as the eldest, working shifts after school and tutoring rich kids at nearby Glenridge Prep just to afford basic supplies. But she never lost her grace. Even as a teenager, she was composed, kind, and hauntingly mature. The town called her Little Mrs. Carter, and while other kids daydreamed about prom in Paris, Melanie dreamed of stability, of peace, and of seeing her mother laugh without worry again. She didn't want fame or glitter. She just wanted a life where she could exhale. Melanie's job as a front desk concierge at the Whitmore Hotel, a sleek business-class lodge in downtown Ardendale, wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She had a natural way with guests, her tone was calm, her smile soft but sincere. Regulars adored her and management relied heavily on her subtle people skills. Her quiet routine was peppered with small joys, Sunday morning walks with Camille, Thursday board game nights with her mother, and secret journal entries scribbled on hotel-branded notepads. Her life was simple, disciplined, and safe, until Jason Monroe walked into the Whitmore lobby with a crooked grin and a cell phone glued to his ear. Drenched from the rain, he approached her desk with an apology in his voice and frustration in his eyes. His room booking had glitched, and he was already late for a meeting with prospective investors. Melanie handled it swiftly, her voice soothing his edge, offering him a temporary upgrade and warm towel. That was the first time he looked at her properly, beyond her plain uniform, beyond her lack of high heels or designer polish. Something about her steadiness disarmed him, though he didn't yet understand why. Jason Monroe was unlike any guest she'd assisted before. He returned to the front desk the next day, not for a complaint, but to ask for a list of nearby cafes she personally recommended. He kept asking questions, his charm polite but persistent. Melanie, cautious but intrigued, gave polite, short answers. Days turned into weeks. Each evening, Jason lingered longer in the lobby, claiming to be working remotely while occasionally stealing glances toward the concierge stand. Melanie pretended not to notice, though Camille teased her mercilessly once she found out. Jason eventually asked her to dinner, not in a flashy, overconfident way, but quietly, genuinely. Melanie hesitated, aware of how fragile her family's life still was, but her mother urged her gently, "You've carried us for so long, sweetheart. Maybe let someone walk beside you for once." That was the night Melanie first wore a red dress instead of her work uniform. That was the night her story truly began. Jason Monroe wasn't born into struggle, but he wasn't born into softness either. His father, Reginald Monroe, was a real estate mogul known more for his ruthless business dealings than for being a father. Jason's mother died when he was 10, an aneurysm that struck one rainy morning and left him in the care of a man who only measured worth in numbers and wins. Reginald believed vulnerability was weakness, and Jason grew up learning to suppress emotion, focus on dominance, and view people as leverage rather than connection. After attending prestigious prep schools and a top finance college, Jason started his career under his father's shadow in the Monroe conglomerate. But his ideas, bold, ethical, sometimes humanitarian, clashed with Reginald's cold, hard tactics. When Jason refused to push a foreclosure deal that would displace dozens of families in Detroit, Reginald publicly shamed him, and Jason walked out, cut off, disinherited, but hungry to prove himself. He wanted to build something on his own terms. Something that would prove to the world, and to Reginald, that success didn't have to be cruel. But independence wasn't as glamorous as it seemed. For 2 years after breaking away from his father, Jason crashed. His first 2 investments tanked. A luxury condo project in Phoenix fell apart after a zoning war, and a promising commercial build in South Carolina got mired in legal disputes. Investors pulled out. He began couch surfing between friends' homes, including his only true friend, Noah Brennan, a tech consultant turned marketing guru, who kept urging him not to quit. Still, Jason found himself in a tight spot, barely holding onto his last asset, a 3-lot development plan in Ardendale. His confidence wavered, especially after his girlfriend at the time, Amanda Voss, left him for a wealthier businessman. Amanda's departure stung deeper than he admitted. She had flaunted her connections to attract investors for Jason's ideas but had also drained his accounts, maxed out his cards, and left him bruised both emotionally and financially. His trust in women became another casualty in the war between his dreams and his reality. He arrived in Ardendale, soaked in rain and cynicism, ready to fight, but not expecting that a soft-spoken concierge would be the one to reset his compass. Melanie wasn't part of his plan, at least not in the way success stories usually included a love interest. She wasn't flashy, didn't care for titles, and never asked him about money. She was efficient, honest, and perceptive. Jason found himself seeking her calm the way a drowning man seeks air. After their first dinner, it became a routine, simple dates, thoughtful conversations, slow walks through local parks. She wasn't impressed by his connections, because she didn't ask about them. Instead, she asked about his dreams, his regrets, and his favorite memories of his mother. Melanie made him feel seen without effort. As his confidence slowly returned, Jason began sketching new project ideas again. This time, he wanted to build affordable housing units, sustainable, modest, but dignified. Melanie even helped him research community impact models. She became more than a companion, she became his anchor, his quiet partner, his mirror. For the first time in years, Jason didn't feel like he was running to prove something. He was building something real, and Melanie was right there with him. The engagement came on a quiet winter evening, inside the bakery's back kitchen, with the scent of cinnamon rolls wafting between them and Jason nervously gripping the ring he'd bought with his last few $1,000s. It wasn't a grand proposal, and Melanie wouldn't have wanted it to be. He slipped her late grandmother's ring, restored and resized, onto her finger as tears welled in her eyes. Denise clapped her flour-covered hands, and Camille whooped so loud the neighbors heard. But marriage, especially one born out of struggle, didn't come with magic. As Jason poured himself into building his company, Monroe Properties, Melanie took on extra shifts at the Whitmore, picking up housekeeping work on the weekends and temping at a nearby law firm during holidays. They lived in a small one-bedroom apartment where the ceiling creaked and the pipes moaned, but they made it home with string lights, second-hand furniture, and shared laughter. Melanie shelved her own dreams of going back to school to study psychology. When Camille asked her why, Melanie simply said, "Because Jason believes in me. And right now, I need to believe in him." It was love, yes, but love dressed in compromise, patience, and long nights with empty stomachs. Jason's first big break came when a retired architect, Mr. Lowrenner, offered him the blueprints for an abandoned downtown plaza, one he tried to sell for years. But Jason needed capital to pitch the redesign, and the banks weren't biting. Without hesitation, Melanie dipped into the small education fund she'd built quietly over the years, money saved dollar by dollar, week after week. She never told Jason how hard it was to let that go, how many hours she'd sacrificed to build it. Instead, she told him, "Take it. I know you'll multiply it." Jason cried that night. She'd never seen him cry before. That was when he introduced her to Noah Brennan, his sharp but observant best friend from college, who would soon become the company's strategy lead. Noah liked Melanie instantly. He noticed how grounded she kept Jason. But even then, something in Noah's eyes suggested a quiet warning, a trace of concern that Jason, and all his ambition, might one day forget who held him up when the world had turned away. With Melanie working almost around the clock and Jason obsessing over building permits, contracts, and zoning laws, their lives became a delicate choreography of survival. They barely had time for romance, but they clung to simple routines, coffee together on Monday mornings, texts exchanged between meetings, and late-night dinners over instant noodles. Camille, now in college studying sports therapy, often visited with groceries and updates, while Denise's arthritis worsened, forcing her to close the bakery. Melanie insisted on supporting her mother, paying bills, and ensuring Camille had everything she needed for school. The load was heavy, but Melanie never dropped it. She carried everyone, quietly, gracefully. Jason, meanwhile, started attending networking events, late-night investor dinners, and business retreats with Noah, always assuring Melanie that it was just business. She believed him. She wanted to. But in the shadows of their sacrifices, seeds were already being planted, seeds watered not by intention, but by distraction, exhaustion, and silent unmet needs. And unknown to them both, fate was already scribbling its twist just beyond the margins of their love story. Their wedding wasn't splashed across magazines or held at a vineyard under a sunset sky. Instead, it took place on a chilly spring morning inside the Ardendale Civic Chapel, a modest hall with wooden pews and the scent of fresh lilies donated by one of Melanie's former guests at the Whitmore. Melanie wore a cream satin gown Camille had helped her stitch over several weeks, while Jason donned a classic black suit Noah had gifted him, complete with a silver tie pin bearing the initials J&M. Denise, seated proudly in the front row despite the pain in her joints, wept through the ceremony. The reception was held in the community center near Ridgevale Park, where neighbors, co-workers, and friends danced under fairy lights hung by Camille and Brian, one of Jason's newest interns. There was no champagne tower or 10-tiered cake, just laughter, promises, and a sense that the hardest part was behind them. Melanie, resting her head on Jason's shoulder during their slow dance, whispered, "This is everything I dreamed of." He held her tighter, almost too tight, and told her, "I'll never let anything ruin this." But even then, fate was standing at the door in heels and red lipstick. 3 weeks later, Melanie was adjusting to married life with the same balance of grace and determination that had carried her through struggle. She and Jason were now living in a slightly larger apartment closer to the First Monroe Properties site, which was finally breaking ground. Noah often dropped by after work meetings, and Camille, on semester break, had moved in temporarily to help Melanie reorganize the small space. Life felt full, almost too fast-paced, but filled with hope. Then came the Investors Gala, a black-tie event hosted by Ardendale's City Chamber, honoring young developers who had shown promise in revitalizing urban areas. Jason, nominated for Emerging Visionary of the Year, invited Melanie, but she couldn't attend due to a flu that had kept her bedridden all week. Camille offered to go in her place, but Jason declined, saying Noah would accompany him. That night, Jason shook hands with CEOs, posed for photos, and mingled with influential names, but it was the striking model near the bar, wearing an emerald silk gown and a gaze that didn't blink, who left an impression. Her name was Sierra Blaine. Tall, sculpted, and notoriously elusive, she was a former runway star turned investor liaison for an LA-based fashion real estate collective. Her presence at the gala wasn't expected, and yet she moved through the room like a storm that knew exactly which buildings to flood. Jason noticed her before she noticed him, but it didn't take long for her to slide beside him near the bar, offering a smile that felt like a challenge. Their conversation was brief but electric. Sierra praised his concept for sustainable mid-income housing and said she saw potential for high-end collaboration in future mixed-use models. Jason laughed, charmed, flattered, and unaware that this wasn't just a passing flirtation. Sierra didn't look for men, she hunted them, especially the ones who looked like they were being held together by ambition and quiet dissatisfaction. And when Jason left the gala, buzzing from compliments and champagne, he didn't tell Melanie about Sierra. He told her it was just some great networking, while Camille, browsing social media, noticed a tagged photo of Jason, smiling too comfortably beside a woman she didn't recognize, yet wouldn't forget. Jason's career began to skyrocket after the gala, with Monroe Properties finally making the leap from hopeful startup to rising force in Ardendale's competitive real estate scene. Investors from other states began reaching out after media coverage of the gala mentioned his sustainable building vision. Noah, ever the diligent strategist, helped streamline their next 2 projects, and soon the company was preparing for its first high-profile apartment complex near the Bay. Jason was attending boardroom meetings, flying out for weekend retreats, and getting invitations to mingle with city officials. Melanie, proud but overwhelmed, found herself waking up to empty sheets and going to bed with unanswered texts. She didn't question him at first. She had lived beside Jason during his hardest failures and trusted his intentions. But something about his silence lately, the missed dinners and clipped replies, left an ache in her chest she couldn't explain. Still, she buried it beneath smiles and coffee mugs, choosing to focus on managing her schedule, caring for Denise, and helping Camille adjust back to school. She told herself this was the price of building an empire, that distance sometimes came before rewards. What she didn't know was that Jason's silence wasn't from stress, it was from distraction. At the Whitmore, Melanie fainted during her concierge shift one afternoon. She had skipped breakfast, she claimed, and perhaps the heat in the lobby was too much. A kind guest helped her into a chair and offered to call a doctor, but Melanie politely declined. Camille, who had just returned from campus, rushed over once she got the message and drove her to urgent care despite her sister's resistance. The doctor's words came softly after some blood work. "You're pregnant, Melanie. About 6 weeks." The news knocked the air from her lungs, not from fear, but from awe. She hadn't even considered the possibility amid the chaos of late nights and early work shifts. Camille burst into tears of joy and immediately began brainstorming baby names in the car while Melanie sat quietly, her hand over her belly, feeling both elated and terrified. That night, she prepared a handwritten letter for Jason, an old habit she always used when she needed to say something from the soul. But Jason didn't come home until after midnight. He kissed her forehead half asleep, murmured something about zoning issues, and fell into bed. The letter remained unopened on the nightstand. Meanwhile, in a chic rooftop lounge overlooking downtown, Sierra Blaine sipped martinis and watched Jason across the table. Their meetings had become accidental, bumping into each other at networking mixers, exchanging business advice over shared Uber rides, then laughing over cocktails under candlelight. Jason had told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. There were no touches, no kisses, only conversations, and surely he was allowed to talk to someone who understood high-level investor language better than Melanie ever could. Sierra, on the other hand, was playing a different game. She knew men like Jason, eager to be seen, desperate to feel validated, and blind to their own unraveling until the fall was too steep. She fed him admiration masked as challenge, disagreement disguised as flirtation. Every word she spoke was tailored to make him feel like a king in the wrong castle. And when she finally leaned in to brush imaginary lint from his lapel, Jason didn't stop her. In fact, he let her. What Jason didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Sierra had her own reason for being in Ardendale. And Jason Monroe was part of a much larger plan than just romance. Camille Carter had always been the fire to Melanie's water, fierce, outspoken, and deeply loyal to her sister's quiet strength. While Melanie softened with patience, Camille confronted with precision. And in recent weeks, she had sensed a shift in Jason that unsettled her. She had seen the subtle changes, the missed family dinners, the canceled plans, the cold tone when Melanie called during business hours. But it wasn't until she scrolled through her Instagram feed and spotted a tagged photo of Jason at a private brunch with Sierra Blaine that her instincts ignited. Sierra's reputation preceded her, a woman known for networking with precision, seducing powerful men, and rebranding herself in every city she visited. Camille had friends in fashion circles who whispered about her charm and her calculated relationships. That photo, Jason laughing too freely, Sierra's hand resting just too closely on his wrist, set Camille's protective instincts ablaze. She didn't wait to stew in silence. That evening, she confronted Jason directly, catching him in the apartment hallway before he left for another strategy session. Her voice was firm, her gaze sharper than ever. "I don't know what's going on, but if you even think about hurting my sister, I will make sure you regret it." Jason, caught off guard, laughed it off at first. "You've always been dramatic, Camille," he said, brushing past her with the arrogance of a man who thought he still held control. But Camille didn't back down. She told him she knew who Sierra was and what she was capable of, and warned him that Melanie deserved better than to be toyed with by someone who once cried in her arms when his ex left him broken. Jason's face hardened, but he said nothing, merely adjusting his cufflinks and disappearing into the elevator. Camille, frustrated and boiling with anxiety, returned to Melanie's side that night and found her folding tiny baby clothes she'd secretly bought after her ultrasound. Melanie's glow was subtle, her joy delicate, and Camille didn't have the heart to destroy it with suspicion. So, she said nothing, for now. But her eyes didn't sleep that night. Instead, she stayed up researching Sierra's past, digging through archives, whispering into late-night calls with friends and PR. Camille didn't just want answers. She wanted proof. And she vowed she would get it before it was too late. Meanwhile, Denise Carter had begun to notice changes too. Though her health had improved slightly with Camille managing the household finances and groceries, Denise was no fool. As a woman who had once survived betrayal herself, she could smell the storm building even through the silence. She tried gently asking Melanie if everything was okay, but Melanie, ever protective, smiled and replied that Jason was simply under pressure. Still, Denise decided to host a family dinner, an old tradition that once brought them joy and healing. She invited Camille, Jason, and even Noah, who had become like an honorary member of the Carter family. Melanie loved the idea. She saw it as a chance to reconnect with Jason, to share the pregnancy news with him in front of people who loved them both. Denise prepared her famous roasted duck, Camille decorated the table, and Melanie baked the same apple crumble she once sold at her mother's bakery. But Jason never showed up. A last-minute call from him claimed he was trapped in an investor dinner. Melanie forced a smile. Camille bit her tongue so hard it bled. And Denise looked at her daughters from across the table, realizing the ache of being a mother wasn't in your bones, it was in watching the people you love walk straight toward heartbreak, and knowing you could only catch them once they fell. Melanie spent the next week throwing herself into preparations for a small surprise dinner she had planned for Jason. She had been saving up little by little from her side jobs and tips to book a reservation at Delphine's, his favorite steakhouse in downtown Ardendale. It was the same place they had shared a celebratory meal after his first property offer had been accepted, a place wrapped in memories and hope. Camille helped her pick out a soft blue maternity dress, just tight enough to show the hint of her growing bump. Melanie even reached out to Noah and asked him to delay Jason at the office subtly if needed, just to buy her time to get everything perfect. Denise volunteered to cook breakfast for Jason the next morning so she could speak to him one-on-one. Melanie thought she was finally creating the perfect moment, one where she could tell Jason about the baby, about how she believed they were strong enough to face anything together. But the restaurant table remained empty past 7 p.m. And by 8:15 p.m., Melanie was sitting alone, cheeks stiff from smiling at waiters out of embarrassment, as her untouched creme brulee stared back at her like a bad omen. Jason, at that very moment, was in Sierra's penthouse overlooking the river, completely unaware of the dinner Melanie had planned. He had told Melanie earlier that he had a board review and would likely be stuck in late calls, a lie that had now become so rehearsed he barely flinched saying it. Sierra, in a scarlet silk robe, lounged across from him with a tablet in hand, outlining a modeling agency-turned-realty crossover concept she wanted to pursue, one she claimed needed his architectural genius. Jason, flattered and emboldened, offered her insights and even sketched ideas on the back of one of her magazine proofs. Their conversations had shifted from business to intimate humor, inside jokes, and flirtatious sarcasm that blurred professional boundaries. But neither acknowledged it, and that unspoken edge kept Jason coming back. Sierra loved the thrill of control, and Jason fed her ego in all the right ways. She didn't ask about Melanie, and Jason never brought her up, not even when Sierra, mid-laugh, casually draped herself across his lap and whispered something about what powerful men deserved. And though Jason didn't touch her that night, the emotional betrayal had already crossed the line. A line he could never uncross. Back at home, Camille found Melanie sitting by the window, still in her blue dress, her face pale and eyes red-rimmed. She didn't need to ask what happened. Melanie held up the letter she had written weeks ago, still sealed. "I was going to give him this tonight," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Camille sat beside her, squeezing her hand. "You deserve better than this, Mel. You always have." But Melanie, ever the optimist, insisted maybe something urgent had come up. Camille didn't argue. Instead, she quietly began collecting screenshots, photos, and messages she had gathered from her silent investigation into Sierra's public appearances and Jason's whereabouts. She was forming a timeline. She was building a wall. Melanie might have been too blinded by love to see it, but Camille was ready for war. Meanwhile, Sierra finally told Lana Cruz, her flatmate and former agent, about Jason. Lana warned her to be careful. "He's married. He's dangerous if this blows up." But Sierra smirked and replied, "That's the fun part. Let's see who breaks first." And far away from all of them, the baby inside Melanie fluttered gently, as if trying to comfort a mother whose world was beginning to fracture. Melanie spent the morning of their second wedding anniversary preparing a breakfast tray for Jason, scrambled eggs with herbs, buttered toast, and slices of avocado just the way he liked it. She placed a small card beside the plate, with gold script reading "For the man who made me believe in forever." She had rehearsed what she would say when he opened the small gift box wrapped in navy ribbon, a silver baby rattle with "Daddy's first hero" engraved on the handle. Camille helped her practice the words again and again, even though her smile never fully reached her eyes. Jason, as expected, had left early claiming he had a morning meeting with Noah about the Ocean Point expansion. Melanie didn't push back. She just nodded, kissed his cheek, and tucked the rattle back in her purse. She still wanted the moment to be special, even if it came late. That evening, she arranged a candlelit dinner at home, her homemade lamb roast filling the apartment with warmth. She wore the same dress she had worn on their honeymoon dinner in Vermont. But by 10:42 p.m., Melanie was sitting alone once again, her hand resting protectively on her belly, the food gone cold, and her eyes fixed on the door that never opened. Jason wasn't at any expansion meeting. He was on the rooftop bar of the Cross, the new high-rise he had invested in, celebrating a contract closing with Sierra and a group of sleek executives from New York. The night was filled with clinking glasses, designer laughter, and promises of international partnerships. Sierra dazzled in a backless black gown, her wine-colored lips curling around secrets. At some point between a toast and a rooftop dance, she leaned in and kissed Jason on the cheek, a calculated gesture that earned raised eyebrows and camera flashes. Jason didn't flinch. He smiled. And when one of the executives jokingly asked if Sierra was Mrs. Monroe, Jason laughed and replied, "Not quite. But maybe soon." That answer lingered in Sierra's mind long after the music died down. She had been the mistress before, many times. But this time, she wanted the crown. Meanwhile, across town, Noah sat alone at a diner nursing black coffee, his phone lighting up with missed calls from Melanie and texts from Camille. He hadn't seen Jason since lunch. And while part of him wanted to believe Jason was simply distracted, another part, the part that had always questioned his loyalty, knew something was wrong. Later that night, Jason stumbled into the apartment just past midnight, reeking of wine and expensive perfume. Melanie was curled on the couch, her dress slightly wrinkled, her eyes red from holding back tears. He didn't say much, just a half-hearted apology about the meeting running late. Melanie stood, walked to him slowly, and placed the navy-wrapped box in his hand without a word. Jason, confused, opened it. His expression froze as he read the engraving. For a brief second, real emotion cracked through his polished mask. "You're pregnant?" he asked, eyes flickering between disbelief and panic. Melanie simply nodded, her voice barely audible. "Yes. I wanted to tell you tonight." Jason said nothing. No congratulations. No embrace. Just a stiff, awkward silence that widened the gap between them. He set the rattle down and disappeared into the bathroom. Melanie stood there alone in their shared space, holding herself as tears finally slid down her cheeks, not just because of his reaction, but because in that moment, she realized something vital had changed. The man she had fought so hard to build with wasn't standing beside her anymore. He was already somewhere else. And she didn't know how to bring him back. The gala arrived with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for royal events. Monroe Properties had finally landed a multi-million-dollar commercial redevelopment contract with one of Ardendale's oldest shipping conglomerates, and Jason was being honored as one of the youngest CEOs to ever lead such a project. The ballroom at the Grand Eden Hotel shimmered with crystal chandeliers and velvet carpeting, a space dripping with wealth and cloaked deception. Melanie had been invited weeks ago, at least, formally. But when she fell ill days before the event, fatigued from her growing pregnancy and long shifts at work, Jason had used her health as a convenient excuse. "You need to rest. Stress isn't good for the baby," he had said, brushing a kiss on her forehead. What he didn't say was that he had already promised Sierra she could accompany him, not as a date, but as a corporate consultant interested in urban luxury crossover models. That night, Melanie stayed in bed, rubbing her stomach and watching the clock tick past the event start time, wondering if he would text, call, or check in. He didn't. She eventually drifted into restless sleep, unaware that Camille had followed through on a quiet plan of her own. Camille had suspected something would happen at the gala. She had hacked together a pass using a media contact's discarded badge and slipped into the Grand Eden wearing a sleek, borrowed black gown. She arrived an hour after the event had begun and immediately scanned the crowd, staying in the shadows near the champagne bar. The moment her eyes found Jason, her stomach dropped. He stood confidently near the stage, drink in hand, and Sierra on his arm in a gold silk dress with a neckline far lower than corporate etiquette. The crowd buzzed with admiration as they posed for photos. At one point, Jason introduced Sierra to a group of investors as an integral part of our new creative direction. Camille captured every second, videos, photos, timestamps, all stored securely in her encrypted drive. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with rage. It was one thing to cheat. It was another to do it so openly, to flaunt it among the same people who knew he had a wife. And a baby on the way. Camille knew she couldn't confront him, not here, not yet. But the fire inside her was stoked. And she would not let this betrayal pass without consequence. Later that night, while Melanie lay in bed with her phone beside her, Camille slipped into her room, sat down at the edge of the mattress, and gently woke her. Melanie blinked up, confused, and tried to sit up, but Camille stopped her. "Don't strain yourself," she whispered. Then, she handed Melanie her phone. "You need to see something." What followed was a series of images and clips, Jason and Sierra entering the gala together, smiling for the press, their body language not just familiar but intimate. Melanie's hands shook as she scrolled, her breath shallow, her world breaking silently beneath her. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared. "I didn't want to show you," Camille said softly, "but you deserve to know the truth." Melanie didn't speak for several minutes. And then, finally, in a calm and even voice that scared Camille more than yelling ever could, she said, "Thank you. I know what I need to do now." Her eyes, though glassy, were filled with something Camille hadn't seen in weeks. Resolve. Somewhere between betrayal and heartbreak, Melanie had found her footing. And soon, Jason would realize just how much damage a quiet woman could cause when her silence was betrayed. The morning after the gala was drenched in eerie quietness. Jason moved through the apartment as though everything was normal, humming under his breath, checking emails, and sipping coffee Melanie had brewed hours before but left untouched. Melanie observed him silently from the hallway, studying the man she once considered her safe place. There was no remorse in his posture, no sign of discomfort, only a subtle arrogance that made her stomach churn. When he kissed her cheek before heading out, she smiled faintly and nodded, letting him walk out the door unscathed, for now. The moment it closed, she walked straight into his study and began opening drawers. She wasn't searching blindly. She was done giving him the benefit of the doubt. She opened his laptop, scrolled through emails, checked browser history, and opened recent downloads. And there it was, a reservation at the Valencia Hotel made 2 weeks ago under his name, with Sierra Blaine listed as the guest. The booking included spa access, a couple's suite, and an expensive champagne package for Jason and S. Melanie didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply screenshotted everything and transferred copies to her encrypted drive. War had been declared. And she had no intention of losing. Melanie needed help, someone discreet, skilled, and loyal. That was when she remembered Ava Sinclair, her childhood best friend from Ridgevale, now a licensed private investigator operating out of Fairmont City. Ava had always been sharp, a little wild, and fiercely protective. They hadn't spoken much in recent years, life pulling them in different directions, but Melanie knew she could trust her. Within an hour, Ava responded to her message with a firm "I'm on my way." That same afternoon, Ava arrived at Melanie's apartment in black jeans, a leather jacket, and eyes that saw through everything. "Tell me everything," she said, skipping pleasantries. Melanie did, every missed dinner, every lie, every gut feeling she'd ignored for too long. Ava didn't take notes. She didn't have to. "We'll tail him for a week," she said, already forming the plan. "If he's dirty, we'll get the evidence. All of it." Camille, hearing voices, joined them and immediately recognized Ava, throwing her arms around her in relief. "If anyone can burn him to ash," Camille said, "it's you." And just like that, a quiet alliance formed, 3 women, 3 hearts sharpened by betrayal, and one objective: expose Jason Monroe. That night, Jason claimed he had a late strategy meeting with Noah at the downtown workspace. Melanie smiled and kissed him on the cheek before he left, and then immediately texted Ava and Camille, who were already waiting in a parked SUV a block away. They followed him carefully, using Ava's rental car with out-of-state plates. Jason didn't go to the workspace. He didn't go anywhere near Noah's last known location. Instead, he drove to the Valencia Hotel, the same one from the email. Ava snapped high-resolution photos from her long-lens camera as Jason walked in and was greeted by Sierra at the entrance. They hugged, and Sierra kissed his cheek. Ava's voice was cold and steady. "We've got him." Camille's knuckles whitened on the dashboard. "We're just getting started." Back at home, Melanie sat on the couch in silence, a calm rage settling over her. Her hand rested on her belly, her other gripping the silver baby rattle from weeks before. Jason had stolen her peace, her trust, and her future dreams, but he had no idea that she still held something more powerful than anything he could ever own. The truth. And soon, she would weaponize it. A week passed like a blur of icy silences and meticulous observation. Melanie continued to play her role as the supportive wife flawlessly, packing Jason's lunch, ironing his shirts, offering kisses on the cheek, while her mind calculated every step like a seasoned tactician. Ava and Camille had gathered more than enough evidence: surveillance videos, credit card statements, time-stamped hotel records, and even audio recordings from Jason's own conversations at the Valencia, captured by a discreet device planted in Sierra's room service tray. But nothing prepared Melanie for the final blow. On a Sunday morning, while Jason claimed he was flying to Boston for a property tour, Ava intercepted the flight log. There was no Boston trip. Instead, Jason had chartered a private jet to an exclusive island resort known for celebrity engagements. Melanie's hands shook as she held the printout. "He's going to propose," Ava said flatly. Camille gasped, then covered her mouth. "He wouldn't. Not with her. Not with the ring." But Melanie already knew. Her grandmother's vintage diamond ring, the one she had worn proudly for 2 years, had gone missing weeks ago. Jason had mumbled something about taking it in for resizing. And now, she knew exactly where it was going. Ava wasted no time. Through her contact at the island's event management team, she secured access to the resort's internal camera feeds. That same night, she sent Melanie a file labeled "Confirmed." Melanie sat alone in her bedroom, her heart pounding so loudly it was almost deafening. She opened the file and watched, frame by frame, as Jason knelt on the edge of a candlelit balcony, overlooking the ocean. Sierra stood in front of him in a pale silver dress, her eyes wide with mock surprise. In his hands was her ring, Melanie's family heirloom, slipped onto the finger of the woman who had invaded her marriage. The room around her blurred. Melanie couldn't feel her legs. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She gripped the armrest to stop herself from screaming, but the silent tears betrayed her strength. Camille rushed in moments later, falling to her knees at the sight of her sister. "He did it," Melanie whispered. "He proposed. With my ring." Then, without warning, she clutched her belly, her body seizing in pain. Camille shouted for help. Melanie collapsed onto the floor. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it had become physical. And her unborn child was now caught in the storm. Melanie was rushed to St. Augustine General Hospital in the early hours of dawn. Denise arrived shortly after, still in her nightdress, her face pale and stricken with fear. The doctors stabilized Melanie, confirming that she had suffered a stress-induced pre-labor scare. The baby's heart rate was erratic but responsive. She would need full bed rest, no stress, and around-the-clock observation. As Melanie lay motionless, for dripping slowly into her arm, she stared blankly at the ceiling, replaying Jason's proposal in her mind. Not the words, not Sierra's smile, but the moment he knelt. That gesture, the one he had once used to promise her forever, now belonged to someone else. Camille paced outside the room, eyes burning with rage, while Ava stood in the hallway, fists clenched. "This isn't over," Ava said through gritted teeth. "He thinks this is the end of the story, but he just opened the wrong chapter." Melanie finally turned to the nurse and whispered, "Call Noah Brennan." The nurse hesitated. "Please," Melanie repeated. "Tell him. I need to talk. Urgently." Because Jason had taken too much already. Her trust. Her peace. Her ring. But he had overlooked one fatal mistake. Legally, he had built his empire in her name. 2 days after Melanie's collapse, she sat propped against the white pillows of her hospital bed, her skin still pale but her mind sharp, sharper than it had ever been. Camille sat beside her holding her hand, while Denise stayed close, quietly humming old lullabies and rubbing her daughter's swollen feet. It was Noah Brennan who arrived mid-afternoon, his face flushed with concern and regret. Melanie, he said gently, I had no idea things were this bad. She looked at him for a long moment, her voice calm but clipped. I need your help, Noah. I need to take back everything he built, because it was never his to begin with. Confused, Noah listened as Ava stepped in, opening her laptop and showing a detailed financial map of Monroe Properties. Through subtle legal maneuvers, years earlier Jason had placed the majority of his company's assets, his properties, accounts, and intellectual ownership under Melanie's name to avoid tax scrutiny. What was meant to be a financial loophole for Jason's benefit had become Melanie's most powerful weapon. I never thought I'd need it, she said quietly. But now I do. Every account, every asset. We freeze it. Legally. Immediately. Noah nodded, stunned. The storm Jason created was about to turn. By the following morning, Ava had partnered with corporate attorney Marcia Glenn, a brilliant, sharp-witted woman with a reputation for dismantling corrupt CEOs. Marcia reviewed the financial structure and confirmed what Ava had suspected. Melanie had full authority to freeze assets without Jason's approval. It's rare, Marcia said, but legal. He'll never see it coming. Within hours, Melanie signed documents authorizing an immediate halt on all Monroe Properties transactions, wire transfers, and ownership shifts. Every cent tied to Jason's development empire was now locked, pending Melanie's approval to release it. Noah, watching the operation unfold, leaned back in his chair, both impressed and horrified. You know this will destroy him, he murmured. Good, Camille snapped. That's the point. Melanie remained quiet, her eyes focused on the screen as Ava hit confirm. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Jason and Sierra were lounging poolside at the island resort, sipping champagne and discussing luxury development ideas. Jason's phone began buzzing rapidly. Texts. Emails. Calls. Notifications swarmed his device, each one a growing alarm. His banking app flashed, access denied. His business chat rooms were flooded with messages, why are our accounts frozen? What's going on? We're pulling out if this isn't fixed. He blinked, confused, then panicked. Sierra noticed the change in his expression and sat up straighter. Jason? What's wrong? He couldn't answer. His hands trembled as he tried another password reset, then checked the cloud drive, also restricted. He called Noah. No answer. He called Brian Adler, his executive assistant. Still no answer. He called the bank. After minutes on hold, a representative confirmed it. All assets tied to Monroe Properties have been temporarily frozen by the controlling partner. Mrs. Melanie Monroe. Jason's throat closed. She can't, he started, but the line went dead. Sierra's smile faltered. Jason, she repeated. He stood, rage rising like fire under his skin. She froze everything, he whispered. She froze my entire damn company. Sierra's expression hardened. Then unfreeze it, she snapped. But Jason was already dialing another number, pacing, sweating. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control. Back in Ardendale, Melanie sat in her hospital bed, her phone in hand, her voice calm as she answered a call from a panicked board member. Yes, it was me, she said firmly. No, I'm not reconsidering. Tell Mr. Monroe. Welcome to the consequences. And as she hung up, she gently touched her belly and whispered, You're safe now, baby. Mama's awake. News of the asset freeze broke within 24 hours, spreading like wildfire through Ardendale's business circles, corporate boardrooms, and social media feeds. Monroe Properties, a company once hailed as the model of fast, clean urban expansion, was now under siege. Local news stations aired footage of half-completed construction sites suddenly abandoned, vendors demanding payment, and legal analysts speculating about internal fraud or embezzlement. Speculation morphed into scandal when someone leaked a confidential board memo confirming that Jason Monroe no longer had financial access to his own company. Jason tried to hold a press conference to quell the panic, but his answers were evasive, and the press smelled blood. Where is your wife? One reporter asked. Is it true she controls the company structure? Another demanded. Jason, sweating beneath the stage lights, forced a half-smile and replied, There's a misunderstanding. Everything's being resolved internally. But behind the curtain, chaos was brewing. Investors were withdrawing funds, suppliers were canceling deliveries, and legal teams were demanding answers. Jason returned home to a stack of certified letters and a voicemail inbox filled with threats, resignations, and pleas. He slammed the door and screamed into the silence, but even the walls had stopped listening. Sierra was livid. Her carefully curated image was starting to crack under the pressure of exposure. She had accepted interviews with real estate blogs and fashion publications, hinting at her future with a property tycoon, only for that future to go up in smoke. Worse still, she was blindsided during a live radio interview when the host casually asked, "How does it feel to be engaged to a man whose wife just took over his empire?" Sierra blinked, frozen, before laughing it off and abruptly ending the call. Back at the suite, she threw a wineglass against the wall and demanded answers. "I thought you had this handled," she yelled. Jason, pacing like a madman, snapped back, "I didn't think she'd pull the damn rug out from under me." But the truth was sinking in. He had underestimated Melanie's intelligence, her silence, and the strength she'd hidden behind her softness. Sierra's call stopped being affectionate and started becoming transactional. "If you can't fix this," she warned, "then we have nothing." And for the first time, Jason saw the glint in her eye that reminded him of Amanda, ambition disguised as affection. He realized, perhaps too late, that Sierra had never loved him. She loved what he could offer. Back in Ardendale, Melanie remained silent to the media but calm behind the scenes. She spent her days surrounded by legal documents and advisors, all while fulfilling her hospital's bedrest orders. Ava worked with Marcia Glenn to protect Melanie's assets while Camille, now fired up with a purpose, took over media strategy. "Let them think you're weak," she told her sister. "It makes your next move even louder." Meanwhile, Brian Adler, Jason's longtime executive assistant, finally broke his silence. Disgusted by Jason's affair and his unraveling leadership, Brian tendered his resignation, then anonymously leaked internal memos to several investigative journalists. The documents revealed unethical subcontracting deals, manipulation of project bids, and falsified timelines Jason had ordered to impress early investors. Suddenly, Jason's troubles weren't just personal, they were criminal. As articles flooded online news outlets and trending hashtags like #MonroeMeltdown and #MelanieTheMagnate took over, Melanie turned her phone face down and stared out the hospital window. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "He built it all on my back. And now I'll tear it down brick by brick." And in that moment, the entire city realized Jason Monroe's empire hadn't fallen. It had been reclaimed. The days following the media explosion were a frenzy of collapsing deals, televised speculation, and silent fury. Jason, desperate and paranoid, became increasingly erratic. He was locked out of every official Monroe Properties account, and his name was removed from most board discussions entirely. Noah, once his confidant, had gone completely silent. Sierra, no longer attending public events with him, began forwarding modeling contracts to agencies in Milan. Jason knew his image was dying, and with it, his access to power. But what he didn't know was that the real avalanche hadn't even begun. Ava had uncovered the existence of a warehouse on the outskirts of Ardendale, listed under a dummy corporation registered in Jason's former college roommate's name. At first glance, it looked abandoned. But when Ava visited it in person, posing as a delivery consultant, she discovered security logs and business inventory files hidden in a back office. Using a flash drive, she downloaded everything. That same night, Camille and Ava reviewed the files in Melanie's hospital room. What they found made their blood run cold: records of off-the-book payments to city officials, permits falsified under paid aliases, and, most damning of all, a silent investor named Sierra Blaine with questionable international wire transfers. Melanie sat upright, heart pounding. This isn't just corporate fraud," she whispered. "This is criminal conspiracy." Ava nodded gravely. "If this reaches the feds, Jason won't just lose his company, he'll lose his freedom." Camille stood, pacing. "We need to be smart. If we leak this the wrong way, he'll spin it. Say we're lying. Call it revenge." Marcia Glenn was called immediately and confirmed the worst. The warehouse records, when tied to the leaked internal memos, could open a federal investigation if presented correctly. "We need to leak it indirectly," Marcia advised. "Through a trusted anonymous source. That way, Melanie stays above reproach. Camille agreed instantly. "Let me do it," she said. "I know exactly how to bait the right journalist without leaving a trace." That night, Camille sent an encrypted message to Verity Holmes, a hard-hitting investigative reporter known for exposing corrupt developers. She included screenshots, data logs, and one haunting note: "You thought Monroe's empire collapsed. What if I told you it was built on bribes, lies, and a runway model's dirty money?" Within 48 hours, Verity's story hit the front page of every digital paper in the region, and Ardendale would never be the same. Jason read the article while seated alone at a rooftop bar, hoping for silence but receiving only a death sentence. The headline burned into his retinas: "Monroe Properties Funded by Corruption?" Exclusive documents link CEO to bribery and shell accounts. Beneath it, photos of his warehouse files, redacted emails, and Sierra's name in bold type. Within the hour, his phone exploded. Federal investigators called for an interview. His partners formally severed ties. Sierra, now officially under scrutiny, fled her suite, leaving behind only a note: "You promised power. You delivered ruin." Jason smashed a bottle against the railing and screamed into the dark. He called Melanie. She didn't answer. He called Ava. Voicemail. He finally called Camille. She picked up and said only one thing before hanging up: "You shouldn't have messed with her ring." Jason sat down, the weight of everything sinking in. His buildings were still standing, but his foundation had crumbled. He had taken a queen off her throne thinking she'd stay broken. But she didn't stay down. She rebuilt. Stronger. Smarter. And now, she held the detonator. Melanie, lying in bed with her baby's heartbeat steady beside her, opened her eyes and whispered, "You underestimated the wrong woman." Sierra Blaine awoke in a sterile motel room off the I-83 highway, her phone turned off, makeup smeared, and her carefully curated life in shambles. Gone were the luxury suites, the designer heels lined in velvet boxes, the drivers who once waited at her beck and call. Everything she had built, her name, her leverage, her future, had vanished in less than 72 hours. The federal investigation triggered by Verity Holmes' expose had her name pinned in every wire transfer connected to Jason Monroe's shell companies. Sierra's accounts were frozen. Her modeling contracts were terminated. International fashion houses blacklisted her without public statements. Lana Cruz, her ex-flatmate, had sold screenshots of their conversations to a tabloid for 6 figures, messages that showed Sierra discussing her plans to trap Jason with marriage, cash, and image manipulation. The public was vicious. Former fans branded her a gold digger, an opportunist, a con artist. Sierra's fall wasn't quiet. It was volcanic. And yet, in the crumbling echoes of her chaos, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: fear. Not of the law, but of silence. Of being unseen again. Because Sierra had never feared punishment. She feared irrelevance. And now, she was disappearing, one headline at a time. Lana Cruz, now under her own spotlight, didn't hesitate to capitalize. She booked interviews, sold exclusive photos, and even pitched a tell-all memoir. In one live-streamed appearance, she said with a smirk, "People like Sierra use men like Jason to chase power, but the problem is, she underestimated the wife." The clip went viral. Camille sent the video to Ava, who grinned and forwarded it to Melanie without a word. Melanie watched it in silence, one hand resting on her belly, the other gripping a cup of tea. She didn't smile, but her eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. Meanwhile, Jason, now under full investigation, began spiraling further. His former assistant Brian Adler began cooperating with authorities, offering even deeper insight into the fraudulent deals. More board members walked away. His legal counsel resigned. And Sierra? She vanished. No formal goodbye. No final interview. Just gone. Some said she left the country. Others claimed she checked into a psychiatric facility. But those closest to her knew the truth: Sierra had always thrived on control. Losing it shattered her. And she wasn't ready to be seen in pieces. Back in Ardendale, Melanie was finally discharged from the hospital after weeks of bed rest, though doctors warned her to remain cautious and avoid stress. Denise prepared the home for her return, and Camille hired a nurse to support her sister around the clock. The baby's heartbeat was strong, and Melanie, though emotionally weathered, walked into her apartment with her chin held high. As she entered the living room, she paused by a wall filled with sticky notes, each one a quote, a task, a reminder that she was reclaiming everything. Ava arrived later that evening with legal updates, including a formal statement confirming Melanie as the majority shareholder and sole decision-maker of Monroe Properties. Melanie didn't respond right away. She just stared out the window, letting the weight of survival settle over her shoulders. Jason had proposed to his mistress with her ring, tried to erase her, and built a kingdom on her sacrifices. But she hadn't just endured. She had dismantled him. Now, as her baby stirred inside her and the city whispered her name with awe, Melanie realized she was no longer just a woman fighting for her dignity. She was the storm that silence had trained, and the fire had refined. The sun had barely risen when Melanie was awoken by a sharp, cramping pain that stole the breath from her lungs. At first, she thought it was just another Braxton Hicks episode, her body's strange way of rehearsing for the big day, but this was different. The pain returned, deeper, more rhythmic, and accompanied by a dull pressure in her lower back that didn't ease. Camille, who had spent the night on the couch, rushed into the room the moment she heard Melanie's pained groan. One look at her sister's clenched jaw and pale face was enough. "We need to go now," Camille said, grabbing the hospital bag that had been packed for weeks and barking orders to the nurse. Denise, already halfway dressed, guided Melanie into the car with maternal steadiness while Camille drove like the road owed them speed. Inside the vehicle, Melanie gripped her sister's hand, breathing through each contraction. Despite the pain, there was a fire in her eyes. "He doesn't get to take this moment from me," she said. Camille nodded fiercely, her other hand on the horn as they cut through traffic. "He won't. You're going to bring this baby into the world on your terms." At the hospital, the chaos unfolded with swift professionalism. Doctors and nurses worked in harmony while Melanie was rushed into delivery prep. Her dilation was rapid, more aggressive than expected, which alarmed the staff. They suspected stress had triggered early labor despite Melanie's previously stable vitals. Camille stayed by her side, refusing to leave even as doctors gently asked family to step back. "She's not just my sister," Camille said through gritted teeth. "She's my other half." Denise, meanwhile, stayed in the hallway praying under her breath, holding onto the silver baby rattle that Melanie had once meant to give Jason. Ava arrived moments later, out of breath, with a file of legal papers in her hand, documents finalizing full custody and permanent asset transfer to Melanie. "No matter what happens," Ava said to Denise, "her child will never carry Jason's shadow." Inside the delivery room, Melanie fought through wave after wave of contractions, sweat streaking her face, fingers gripping Camille's hand like a lifeline. She cried once, not from pain, but from release. Years of betrayal, silence, and humiliation purged in that scream. And then, finally, a cry pierced the air, tiny, alive, perfect. A boy. 7 pounds, 6 ounces. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs strong enough to fill the entire hospital room. As the nurse placed the baby on Melanie's chest, she burst into tears, deep, guttural sobs that cleansed years of buried hurt. Camille wept beside her, holding both mother and child as if anchoring them to this new beginning. Denise entered moments later and dropped to her knees, whispering a prayer of thanks. The doctor smiled warmly. "He's strong. And beautiful." Melanie cradled her son, staring into his dark, curious eyes. "Ezra," she whispered. "Your name is Ezra." Around them, the air shifted. A weight had lifted. The war wasn't over, but the battle that mattered most, bringing life, not just surviving it, had been won. Jason was nowhere near. He hadn't called. He hadn't shown. And Melanie didn't care. This moment was pure. It belonged to her, her son, and the circle of women who had protected her like armor. "Welcome to the world, my love," she said softly. "We don't need a king. You were born to be one." Outside, the sky turned golden. And for the first time in a long while, the sunrise felt like a promise. Jason Monroe sat in a dimly lit suite at the Montclair Hotel, hunched over his laptop with bloodshot eyes and a trembling hand clutching a half-empty glass of whiskey. His world had caved in entirely, but he was still foolishly clinging to the hope that this was a nightmare he could charm, manipulate, or negotiate his way out of. He had made dozens of calls, his lawyers, his former board members, Sierra's last known contact, even Marcia Glenn, but they all refused to pick up or had blocked him entirely. The federal agents had already visited once, delivering a formal notice of investigation and requesting his appearance for questioning. His bank accounts were frozen, his cards declined, and every trace of his former life had begun dissolving like fog in daylight. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, surviving on caffeine and desperation, staring at news headlines calling him a fallen mogul and a fraud in designer suits. The worst part wasn't the financial ruin. It was the silence from Melanie. He had expected rage, even pain. But the absence of her voice haunted him more than her revenge. For the first time, he realized she wasn't coming back. She didn't need to. On the third morning of his self-imposed exile, Jason received a call from his only remaining contact, Noah Brennan. The man's voice was cold, firm, and devoid of any former friendship. "We need to talk," Noah said. "In person. Now." Jason barely recognized the man who walked into the cafe 2 hours later. Noah looked cleaner, sharper, stronger. He sat down and slid a manila envelope across the table. "This is everything Melanie knows," he said. "It's enough to bury you. But she's chosen, for now, not to press charges. Not because you deserve mercy, but because she's too busy raising the son you'll never meet." Jason's heart sank. "She had the baby?" he asked, his voice cracking. "A boy?" Noah nodded. "A boy. Named Ezra. And he won't know you, not as you are. Because when he asks who his father is, she'll point to the mirror and say, 'You are what he never could be.'" Jason stared at the envelope, unable to open it. "You could have warned me," he said bitterly. Noah stood to leave. "I did," he said. "You just thought your charm could silence consequences. Now look around. No one's listening anymore." That night, Jason received his final blow. As he stepped out of the cafe and walked back to his hotel, 2 federal agents approached with calm authority. "Mr. Monroe," one said, "you're under arrest for fraud, falsification of corporate records, bribery, and financial misrepresentation." Jason froze, his mind blank, his breath caught in his throat. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Camera flashes erupted from a nearby alley. He was shoved into the back of a black SUV as journalists shouted questions and bystanders jeered. Inside the vehicle, his reflection in the tinted glass was hollow, a shell of a man who had built an empire on someone else's sacrifice and then burned it for vanity. In his cell later that night, he sat on a metal cot, staring at the cold gray wall. For the first time, there were no assistants to clean up his mess, no Sierra to stroke his ego, no Melanie to forgive him. There was only silence, and the quiet echo of a lullaby he remembered once hearing from the kitchen of a one-bedroom apartment. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Ezra." But there was no answer. Only the sound of the door locking behind him. Justice had finally arrived. While the world remained fixated on Jason Monroe's downfall, another story was quietly unfolding, one rooted not in scandal or betrayal, but in grit, healing, and unexpected opportunity. Camille Carter, once considered the wild younger sister, had long lived in Melanie's shadow by her own admission. But something about standing beside her sister through every twist of devastation had changed her. She had found a purpose deeper than vengeance, a desire to build, not just destroy. In the weeks after Ezra's birth and Jason's arrest, Camille launched her long-shelved dream, Carter Core, a boutique fitness and wellness studio designed especially for women overcoming emotional trauma, postpartum challenges, and burnout. Using funds Melanie gifted from her Monroe property stock sale, Camille secured a storefront, built a brand identity, and recruited a team of diverse, passionate instructors. The studio was filled with quotes Melanie had written during her recovery, and Ava helped structure a community program that offered free classes to survivors of emotional abuse. The ribbon cutting was quiet, attended by just friends and family. But within a month, the space was alive with music, laughter, and healing energy. Camille had turned her rage into rhythm, and it pulsed through every heartbeat of the place she built. Meanwhile, Ava Sinclair had found a quiet peace of her own. Her time helping Melanie had rekindled her passion for justice, but it also opened a new door: love. She had grown close to Brian Adler, Jason's former assistant turned whistleblower, after working closely during the investigation. What started as work lunches turned into long conversations, then soft, hesitant touches that neither of them expected. Brian was haunted by his role in Jason's deception, but Ava reminded him daily that redemption was a choice, not a destination. Their relationship was private, real, and refreshing, built on honesty and the refusal to repeat past patterns. Denise, still keeping her home warm and safe, began teaching part-time baking classes again at a local center for single mothers, bringing back her cinnamon rolls and laughter to people who needed them. The Carter women were slowly stitching life back together, not in the absence of pain, but because of it. And Melanie, still recovering post-birth, found herself sitting quietly one evening, watching her baby sleep, the soft hum of Camille's playlist drifting through the room. For the first time in months, her world was not shaking, it was gently unfolding. That same evening, as Camille locked up the studio and turned off the lights, she stood in the darkened doorway and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe. Not because life was perfect, but because it was hers. She had not only protected her sister, she had found herself. She had stepped out from behind Melanie's shadow and into her own bold, beautiful light. Later, as she joined Ava and Brian for dinner, Melanie FaceTimed in holding Ezra, who was wrapped in a tiny hoodie embroidered with Carter Core Baby. They all laughed. Camille smiled, knowing that they had created something sacred out of shattered pieces. Jason's name was still in the headlines, but they no longer flinched at the sight of it. The world knew him now. But more importantly, the world was beginning to know them. Women who didn't just survive betrayal, they built empires from it. Women who had been underestimated, silenced, and scarred, but chose to rise anyway. As Camille raised a toast with Ava and Brian, she said the words that had once echoed from Melanie's lips: "We don't need a king to build a kingdom. We are the blueprint." And in that truth, their futures began. The soft murmur of lullabies filled the Carter home as Melanie sat on the nursery floor with Ezra nestled in her lap. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the walls adorned with pastel decals and framed affirmations. It had been a month since her son's birth, and each day brought with it a quiet kind of joy, a healing unfamiliar but deeply cherished. Denise watched from the doorway, eyes misted, her heart swelling with the kind of pride only a mother could understand. As Melanie lifted Ezra into her arms and rocked him gently, Denise stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You've grown into everything I hoped you'd be," she said, her voice cracking. "Stronger than I ever was." Melanie looked up, startled by the emotion in her mother's eyes. Denise rarely spoke of her past, but that day, she did. She told Melanie about her own marriage, the silent suffering, the betrayal, the isolation. How she stayed long past her heartbreak to protect her daughters. "But you," Denise whispered, "you walked away. And then you stood tall. You made something for your son that I couldn't make for mine." They cried together, 3 generations stitched by pain, and now, by promise. That same week, Melanie returned to court, not for vengeance, but to secure her future. With Marcia, Glenn, and Ava by her side, she finalized legal proceedings that permanently granted her sole custody of Ezra and full executive control of Monroe Properties. The courtroom was nearly empty. Jason had waived his right to appear, his legal team resigned to whatever terms she demanded. When the gavel fell, Melanie felt a strange stillness. There were no cheers, no cameras, no grand exits. Just the knowledge that the chapter was closed. She exited the courthouse to find Camille waiting on the steps, holding a warm chai and smiling wide. "So, CEO," Camille teased. "Does this mean I have to schedule appointments just to see you now?" Melanie chuckled, accepting the cup. "Only if you want to pitch a fitness franchise," she replied. That evening, she stood in the office Jason once used as his fortress, now stripped bare of vanity. She placed a framed photo of Ezra on the desk and stared out the window at the skyline. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the story, making sure that every structure she built from this point on had integrity at its core. No more shadows. Only light. Far across the state, in a small town tucked between pine trees and obscurity, Sierra Blaine walked anonymously into a community center, using a different name, with her once iconic face hidden behind a scarf and oversized sunglasses. She didn't speak to anyone, but she stayed long enough to watch a group of young girls rehearse a charity fashion show. When one of them waved at her, she almost waved back, but didn't. There was no headline to chase anymore, no brand to promote, no man to manipulate. Just silence, consequence, and perhaps, somewhere deep within, a quiet seed of reflection. She vanished from the media cycle altogether. No one knew where she lived now. But that was the price of building a future on deception. You couldn't go back, only forward with whatever pieces were left. Back in Ardendale, Melanie returned home to Ezra cooing in Camille's arms. Denise brought out an old baby blanket she had kept from Melanie's infancy and wrapped Ezra in it. "He belongs to a line of women who never surrendered," she whispered. As Melanie looked at her mother and sister beside her son, she understood something profound. Family wasn't just who stood by you in triumph. It was who never left when everything fell apart. The day Ezra turned 1, the world outside the Carter residence bloomed in colors too poetic to ignore. The garden, once overrun with weeds and memory, was now trimmed, adorned with white and gold balloons, and echoing with laughter and music. It wasn't an extravagant party. Melanie didn't want extravagance. It was intimate, sincere, and alive with the people who had walked through fire with her. Camille chased toddlers with frosting on their faces, Ava and Brian handed out drinks while exchanging inside jokes, and Denise sat beneath a sunshade, bouncing Ezra on her lap and humming a tune from decades past. Melanie stood quietly at the edge of it all, barefoot on grass, hands folded over her heart. She didn't need to be the center of attention. She had spent too long fighting, surviving, rebuilding. Today wasn't about showing strength. It was about feeling peace. Noah arrived with a gift wrapped in navy, inside it, a hand-drawn architectural sketch of a lakeside home, not flashy, just breathtaking in its simplicity. "Thought you might need a vision for what comes next," he said. Melanie hugged him tightly. What came next wasn't a question anymore. It was a choice. Her choice. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the lanterns flickered against the twilight, Melanie rocked Ezra in the nursery, his eyes fluttering between sleep and curiosity. She whispered softly, recounting the stories of the women who had raised him, Denise, Camille, Ava. Not warriors in armor, but in love, resilience, and truth. She told him how his father once believed power was something you claimed, while she now knew power was something you held, when no one else could, when silence demanded you speak, when your name wasn't printed but remembered. Ezra reached up and touched her lips, as if to say shoo, and Melanie smiled, tears gently sliding down her cheeks. This little boy, born in the shadows of betrayal, had brought her into the light. As she tucked him in, she didn't make a wish for his future. She made a promise. You will never wonder who stood for you. You will never need to question your worth. You are not his legacy. You are mine. And with that, she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, not with pain, but with purpose. Melanie stepped out onto the porch of their newly purchased lake house 2 weeks later, watching the sunrise stretch across the water like a final, golden signature on a chapter finally complete. The house wasn't massive, but it was hers, paid for not with blood money, but with earned peace. Carter Corps was expanding, Ava and Brian were engaged, Denise was teaching full-time, and Ezra had taken his first steps across that wooden floor just days earlier. There was no need for revenge anymore. No need to look back. Jason Monroe was serving his sentence, forgotten by those he once controlled, and remembered only by the cautionary tale he had written himself. Sierra's name never reappeared, buried under the weight of anonymity. But Melanie? She became something rarer than famous. She became respected. A woman who had been shattered, then chose to rebuild herself without asking permission. As she leaned against the porch rail, Camille stepped beside her holding 2 mugs of tea. "So," Camille asked, "does it feel like an ending?" Melanie turned to her and smiled. "No," she said. "It feels like the beginning." And as the wind moved gently through the trees, the world opened wide, welcoming her, at last, to peace. The end.